to another episode of Not Without Right, a Shakespeare in the Public Domain podcast. Today, I am joined by acclaimed director Evren Odcikin. And Evren has become a dear friend of late. And right now, he's not directing Shakespeare at all.
Not at the moment.
Last season, um, he had a very, very successful and celebrated production of Macbeth. And I personally had a few questions knocking around my brain that I wanted to chat with him about. So I invited him on the show. So, hey, Evren.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'll be a Shakespeare nerd with you any day. And I wore my Macbeth, sweatshirt for you
Yes,
because you gotta represent.
so exciting. Well, Evren, of course, I did a very poor job of introducing you. Do you wanna tell folks who you are, what you're up to, what you do
Sure.
in this world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a, director, writer, translator, and sometimes artistic leader. I've been working in the American theater for over 20 years at this point, doing those things. I was at Oregon Shakespeare Festival for about 5 to 6 years, associate artistic director, and then as interim artistic director right before Tim Bond came in. And that was sort of my most official Shakespeare job, I guess, and that's where I got to direct Macbeth. But Shakespeare has been sort of part of my life from when I was growing up in Turkey, learning English. It was really a big part of sort of our ESL program there. And it's been classics in general, but Shakespeare specifically, along with the Greeks, have been sort of what brought me into the theater. So, although I probably am known more in general as a new works person, specifically around immigrant stories, Middle Eastern Muslim stories, um, Shakespeare sort of holds a really specific, special place in my heart. And I'm excited to, talk about it. I'm excited to work on it anytime anybody will let me. And it was a real joy actually getting to produce many Shakespeare plays while I was at OSF, including Your Gorgeous Twelfth Night, which is actually probably one of my favorite plays we produced while I was there. So, I can nerd out about it all day.
Great. So then let's do that. Let's jump back in time.
Mm-hmm.
And can you recall your first or perhaps an early experience with Shakespeare?
So I was thinking about this as I sort of prepared to come on this podcast. Um, I can't remember if it was Macbeth or Hamlet, but so my parents took me to the theater from a very early age, like 5, 6, 7, and I like sort of fell in love with it. There's a production of Blood Wedding at Istanbul State Theater that is and I got to direct Blood Wedding as well, and I'm a big Lorca fan. Sort of really burned me up. But another production at that time, but again, I can't remember if it was Macbeth or Hamlet at Istanbul State Theater. I must have been like 8, 9. So I don't remember much from it, other than the fact that it was set in a sort of abandoned railroad crossing, like a station. It was like sort of all black, which a lot of Eastern European, Middle Eastern theater tends to be black on black on black. So that was quite common. And I just remember loving it. Even as a little boy, and then throughout my career, I'm really drawn to language. I'm really drawn to heightened language, whether that being classics or new works. And I feel like a lot of that came from these early experiences of Shakespeare and the Greeks and Lorca, and also, of course, Turkish poetry is quite famous, Ottoman poetry. It's sort of what you're brought up with. In terms of the first time I read, um, it was Romeo and Juliet. So I went to sort of this American sort of bilingual school. So you take English for a year, like 40 hours a week, you learn English. it's like everything you take. There's labs for English accents. It's this crazy program. And then the second year, they sort of give you books and a dictionary, and like you have to sort of figure it out. And it
Off
was
you
that,
go.
yeah, like middle school. So I know Romeo and Juliet was part of that sort of process. And I always say this, Shakespeare is not easy for, native English speakers always. And it was certainly difficult. But I do say that like poetry is a great way to learn a new language. It actually kind of makes your brain wrap itself around it in a different way. And it really worked for me. And I sort of fell in love with it from that point on. I mean, it's like Shakespeare is part of, and this is a very colonial thing, but Shakespeare is part of, in a way, what gave me my now new home language, which is English. I mean, now after so many years, 30 something years, I think in English, I dream in English, I live in the US, it's my home. So in a weird way, Shakespeare holds that sort of very special early place as I was discovering this language that would become my home.
Oh, that's so amazing. I um I sometimes think in Spanish and I'm not even
Yeah.
fluent. So it's crazy. I'm
Brains
very
are so funny about languages. And it's actually, I always say this, like languages, sort of like singing, there's a talent element and then there's a like craft element, right? Like, so some people are just better singers by nature, and some people are better at languages by nature. And then you can
yes.
sort of learn and study and get better at it with craft and hard work. And I happen to be, and to me, that says that you are, given your love of heightened language and how much time you spend in that. I can imagine that you have a certain affinity talent wise to like foreign languages as well.
Yes. Well, I love language.
Yeah,
I'm
you,
very curious. I know you went to essentially like a bilingual immersion
yes.
school. So you said when encountering Romeo and Juliet, you were deciphering it in English. When your parents were taking you to see all these shows, how were you experiencing those? Like, was that Lorca in Turkish or was it
It
in
was, yeah, it
Spanish?
was all in translation. And it's kind of interesting because, and I haven't read a Turkish translation of Shakespeare in a very long time. So I actually am now, this conversation is making me want to go and find one and see what it sounds like. Lorca is really interesting because Spanish to Turkish translation, actually, both languages have a certain, to be stereotypical, like passionate element to it. So it makes sense. It actually works. I'm always usually very disappointed in English translations of Lorca because, like Lorca has things in Blood Wedding. There's like, my loins ache for you, right? Like that's
Yes.
the thing in Lorca. And in Turkish, you can say that and it's fine. When I directed Blood Wedding, every night when our poor actor said that in English, there was a laugh in the audience because English is by its nature a very puritanical language where we do not speak our passions with
Yes. We
such
lack the duende. We
and we
lack
really,
the
we sure do.
duende.
We sure do. And, we're so, in certain ways, especially in our storytelling traditions, sort of can be really stuck in realism, So in American theater, I feel like there's a lot of like, that's not how people talk, kind of thinking around it, which is, I think, probably why I also get so excited about Shakespeare is, yes, I know that's how people talked back then, but now it feels like just the heightened nature of the language and the meter sort of forces you to imagine life larger, bigger, more passionate in a way that sometimes sort of realism doesn't let you. And, given our realism is so scary and weird and awful right now, I can use a little escape from it and being able to imagine worlds through Shakespeare's or other classical writers sort of perspective, which is, lifted. And
Yes.
we can sort of have magic and passion at a size and scope that we don't always encounter in everyday life.
I love that as a child, really, going to see plays at 7 and 8 years old.
Yeah.
You're a babe. Um, that already you were seeing theater, you were experiencing live arts in your mother tongue, in the
Yeah.
Turkish, but also doing this immersion
Yeah.
education where you're also learning to read and write in English, and that kind of dual exposure to Shakespeare is really fascinating to me. I, of course, similar to you, right? Romeo and Juliet, my first encounter with Shakespeare,
Tends to be.
and in that in English, which at the time I would be like, oh, this is old English. I since know that it is not. It is early modern English.
Yes.
Um, and of course, and I talked to some other guests on the show about this too. So I hope to have somebody from Play On come on the show. But
Awesome.
the idea behind the Play On program was that for English speakers to be able to experience the Shakespeare the way other language speakers might get to experience Shakespeare for their first time, so that the you heard it in Turkish that first time
Yeah.
you experienced it, and that maybe this Play On could it'll still be in English, but it could be in a contemporary um, English for English speakers. Have you had an opportunity to be with any of these Play On tech?
I never got to work on one as a director, but I've engaged, we were considering them throughout my time at OSF to see if we could partner on anything. And finally, Coriolanus, Rosa Josie's wonderful production with Sean San Jose's translation happened in the 24 season, which I helped program on my way out. And that was really exciting. I mean, what's so curious about the Play On thing for me is it's still, when it's done right, which Sean had really done a beautiful job with that, you still need voice and text. You still need to work through the language, although you have access to the meaning of the words maybe, or the grammar, etc., in a much more direct way. It's still heightened, right? So it's not just plain English. So it still has it's at least the modern writers are trying to capture rhythmically, or at least in their own voice. I think about Marcus Gardley's King Lear, which I know you co-directed, that has as much Marcus poetry as it does Shakespeare's original
Absolutely.
poetry, which is, wonderful. So I'm always really excited by that experimentation. And I was really excited that that was happening, because I think we're sort of finding ways to engage with it as professionals, but I can only imagine that it's an incredibly useful tool within the educational spaces to be
Yeah.
able to sort of be an access point for young folks who might not share our weird, nerdy, approach to heightened language as students. There are many people who find that language, or how it's taught in the US, very sort of distancing, and that's always really disappointing. I'm a big believer in new works and modern works that speak to our current moment, but I'm always excited when students and young artists are also engaging with what came before at the same time, because I think that sort of juxtaposition is what makes theater so exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a high school student, I had no appetite for Shakespeare,
Oh,
like
interesting.
none. I was already a poet, so I
Mm-hmm.
was very much into poetry. Um, but no Shakespeare whatsoever. That felt so removed from me when I was like 15.
Yeah.
Um, uh, though I yeah, I wonder if I had known what I know now then, right? I mean, that's my whole artist mission, right? Is to let young people know now, so
What you
that they
figured out
don't
along the way.
so that they don't have to deal with some of the stuff I had to deal with. So, Macbeth,
Mhm.
how did you arrive at uh Macbeth? Is it one of your favorites? Did you pick the title? Were you
Yeah.
assigned the title? Tell me.
Well, it was really interesting. So Macbeth was actually part of the 2019 season when I got there. So the season that I took over producing. So when I was trying to put together a 24 season, which given all the financial troubles we were dealing with at the time, was a real like mathematical exercise of figuring out how we could get back up to 9 plays, etc. I knew that the long running Shakespeare needed to be sort of a title, right? Like a title that would work for students, that it would draw. And because the timeline for production was so short, we were so delayed, I sort of assigned that slot to myself because I didn't want to do that to any other director. I knew that because I was inside the machine, I could sort of get something together very quickly. But I was thinking, because we had just done it in 2019, Macbeth was off the table. It is my favorite Shakespeare, no questions. It's the one that I've been obsessed with for 20 plus years. It was the very first full-length production I directed as a 19-year-old. And it's really, I wrote about this in my director's note. There is I think 1974 Trevor Nunn production from RSC with Ian McKellen and Judi Dench that was filmed. It's on YouTube. Everybody should watch it. I watch it like once every 6 months to get myself inspired about theater again. And specifically Judi Dench's performance in that, I point to as the like, oh wait, if this is a possibility, if one day I could make this happen, I can be a theater maker. I sort of look to that performance as like a bit of a pinnacle of what's possible in our medium. So it's been sort of with me for a very long time, and I've sort of formed a lot of thoughts, and I feel like I have like 8 productions of it inside my brain, and I happen to do one now. So, I have 7 more to come, hopefully. I could redirect that show over and over again. So it was really alive for me, but I just had figured I couldn't do it because it was done so recently. So I was actually sort of working towards a totally different play. And when Tim Bond, the new artistic director at OSF, came on board, I was sort of introducing him to what I was thinking about the 24 season. And the show I had selected for myself was his favorite. And he was like, love you, but I'm doing that one. Let's find you another one, which is, fair, very fair. So as we were going through, I sort of made a list and we were talking, and I think he could pick up pretty quickly that I was incredibly passionate about Macbeth. It's a great title. It's a title that's taught in schools. It was kind of a perfect, and we had, between Kevin Kennerly and Erica Sullivan, we sort of had the correct actors who hadn't done it yet, which is kind of shocking to me, and could really step into it. And I knew for both of them, they were sort of the title role and Lady M were sort of dream roles. We had that conversation before. So he was the one that's like, I think you can do it. That was before the pandemic. So 2019 is like 20 years ago, if you think about it. So he sort of gifted me Macbeth that way. And it was really wonderful because, again, because the timeline was so short, in a way, doing the Shakespeare that I know so deeply well. I mean, I had to sort of do the initial cut of that script in a day and a half by myself because I had
oh my gosh.
the sets were, the initial set design was due, I think, like 3 weeks after I knew I was directing it. So I had to sort of, it was a really sort of crazy timeline. Then Rosa Josie came on, who's now the associate artistic director, came on board as my dramaturg, and we did a much more proper cut of the script that went through a much better process. But the fact that I knew it and loved it so much, and I had so many sort of fairly fully formed thoughts about it, became a real asset because we had to move so quickly.
What did you learn in the time between directing it as a 19-year-old sweet baby Evren?
Yes.
and last year's production, in that time that altered or evolved your approach to it, or what you were searching for inside of it?
I'll say 2 things. One, I'd like to think I'm a much better director now. One can only hope. I think my first production, I remember my mentor professor, after it premiered, and he came to see it, he sort of pulled me aside and said, wow, you had really figured everything out. So I thought at that time, like a lot of young directors do, I think, especially male directors, you think you're supposed to come in with all the answers, right? You're supposed to like know everything and tell everyone what to do, right? Like that's
You
sort of,
said it, not me. You said it.
like I certainly started there. And because I'm still a good student, I like to get a gold star, right? like to do a good job. So I think there was a lot of there were no thorny edges. There was no sort of like everything worked, right? Which is good, but also leaves a lot of collaboration and other people's impulses, off the table, which is
Yeah.
the joy of directing now, is that I get to work with people who know more than me, who are more talented than me, who have bigger brains and bigger experiences than me, who can sort of come to what I'm doing and make it bigger and better, which I feel like the Macbeth production at OSF, it was a bit of a dream team. And we always hope for that, right? You put your favorite people together and hope that it's going to work. And that's one of those shows where, that cast completely fell in love with each other. And Kevin and Erica were such wonderful leaders in that room. And everyone was sort of bringing so much of themselves into it, from the designers to my movement John Rua, who did the choreography, T. Carlos Roberts, who did the music. There was just so much talent in that room. I was able to sort of make the final production better than anything I could have imagined it could be. In terms of the content of it, the 19-year-old production, I was just really at the time obsessed with the witches, which I still am. I think they're fascinating. But for me at that time, I was really interested in fate. The central question I was revolving around is what would have happened if they didn't tell him, right? So the witches sort of not only gave him the prophecy, but they also made sure that it went the way they said. So it was a very sort of preordained production, which was interesting, again, intellectually. But I think now, as a 44-year-old, I'm much more interested in how anyone is capable of terrible things. So, and Kevin was very clear on this. He was really interested in all the prophecy and the fate and all of the witch stuff that I was working with. But he was really adamant that it was Macbeth that was making these choices. And he was the one that was over and over again choosing to do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. For good reasons sometimes, for bad reasons sometimes, and what that meant. And especially as we looked around the world where there is layers of violence that's based in sort of dehumanization of the other side. And when we have so many leaders, our president coming in very shortly, who's willing to do anything to win, that felt a lot more interesting now. And I think that's just a more adult, question, a more grown man question of, am I capable of doing this? If I were in a different place, if I could actually look at another group of people or another person and believe they are lesser than me, they are less human than me, would I be okay with enacting that violence on them? And that question became really interesting. So those were sort of very different paths. And then in the process of directing the production, there's just so much politics in Macbeth, actually. It's a bit of a history play as well as a tragedy. So there is actually sort of a history production of it that was coming up, which we ended up excising because it became too much story I ended up refocusing the production on the couple and their relationship. That became the driving factor. So there's like a whole edit of the second act, actually, that we ended up sort of scrapping or changing, that I've kept for another production that's much more about the political machinations of the Scottish royals, the Thanes. That is super interesting to me.
I so many things are bubbling up for me right now. One, I am a true living descendant of Macbeth.
I love it.
So yes, do it again and give us that that political intrigue version because I'd be really excited
Yeah.
to see that. This OSF production was so visceral. And I love that you shouted out your collaborators because it was such a rigorous production in terms of music and movement and the text work and lighting design. I mean, so much of it all had to like just really come together. And it's interesting because I remember the 2019 production, but that's because that was like my last season at OSF
Of course.
before I left Ashland, and that production was also really visceral, like really visually sumptuous, but in a completely not like completely opposite way, but you know, that production was outdoors. That's
Mhm.
different space. It You can use the tools differently. But something that it, and I mentioned that we had lunch a few weeks ago, and I mentioned this to you too, that I've been curious about is that production, the OSF 2019 production directed by Jose, and then your production. And then this season at American Shakespeare Center in Stanton, Virginia, I also saw a Macbeth directed by Jose Zayas, different Jose. And in all three of those productions, the director's ethnicity was different than the actors cast in the leads, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and also those 2 actors have different ethnicities. And and I'm an academic. I keep it low key. I don't want people to think of me as like la 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 la. But it got me really thinking about like the triangulation of culture and the space that the play cracked open for actually things that are not American, that are not the very puritanical, they're not even very like English, right? Like it sort of cracks that space open into something that is um I mean, obviously it's Scottish and Celtic, and but I just wonder, what was it like for you to step into that space and co-create um as an immigrant directing a black man as Macbeth and a white woman as Lady Macbeth? And what was that dance? How did that come up in the room? Did it come up in the room?
Of course. I mean, if you're directing in 2024 in America, anybody who says they are not aware of race are lying, right? The work of a director is to know all the information an audience is getting and to make choices to be able to direct that information in ways that sort of support their theory about this play, right? I will say, and Kevin and I, who played Macbeth and is a black man, talked about this in our early conversations. I was very clear. I did not cast Kevin because he was black, and I did not cast Erica because she was white. So I wasn't exploring that question. However, the moment that casting was finalized, it was in the room and I knew. And basically, what I told Kevin is like, I'm casting you because I'm very interested in you and your impulses as an actor, because Kevin is a very specific kind of actor. For this role, I was interested in a lot of times Macbeth can be cast very young because it's a play about ambition. And I was actually not interested in youthful ambition, which is why I went with Kevin, who's, not a young man in that role, because I wanted someone who had life experience and who had a good life, who was actually putting at risk a very good life to get this other thing. That was a much more interesting question to me. So those were the things. However, it came up only a few times. There were some sort of very violent ways Kevin acted on stage against female-bodied, white-presenting female-bodied humans in the way that we were staging some of the scenes. And when that happened, I just had to go, am I putting meaning on this that I'm not actually intending? And we would have a conversation, and we had to change one of them. Because he also was like, this doesn't feel right. I don't love doing this because I think this is saying something that I don't need to say. Other than that, it didn't end up coming up a lot. But my solution also was to create a world in which where many Black and white people were there.
Yeah.
Right. So I tried to work really hard to make sure that that relationship of a Black man and a white woman wasn't the only one. And that Black men in the play, our Malcolm was Black, our Macduff was Black, our Banquo was Black. So they sort of took on, for the lack of to speak about those roles in very simplified, like good men, bad men, conniving men, like, so it was really important to me that Macbeth was not the only Black male figure on stage. And that we had, Latino actors, we had white women, we had, mixed race actors, all sorts of things. So that felt really important to sort of populate the world in a way where I wasn't singling Kennerly
It
out.
wasn't so that wasn't the story. You weren't trying to like make an Othello out of Macbeth. It was
No,
Macbeth.
it wasn't my interest. And it's in a
Yes.
weird way, like, I'm Middle Eastern, and there is probably a very beautiful sort of Ottoman Empire production of Macbeth, right? Like where you can take Scotland and sort of transpose it to
Yeah.
the culture, like, and I actually would probably put it into the Iranian Empire. It makes more sense in terms of how the Thanes work. I've thought about this, but I chose not to because, again, it wasn't actually about culture for me. What I was interested about was what happens when violence is the accepted form of power, that you win by violence, whoever is the most violent. And when honor is defined in the way that at the time, around the turn of the millennium, when the real Macbeth lived, that really odd Celtic Christian, pagan Christian, Scottish time ended up being really fascinating to me. And it also felt incredibly timely in a lot of ways to the transitional period we're living through now. So it became a really easy way to set it at a certain time and be able to speak to our time directly. And again, Blackness and whiteness doesn't come into that literally.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
was sort of layers of meaning. And then, of course, like, it's not just, John Rua, who's a Latino man, has a very specific vernacular in his movement. I approached him for that syncopated, kind of hip hop inspired, but not fully, kind of has some Latino flair, but not really. It's a very unique, specific individual voice he has that also can really lean into the violence of the fight scenes and the war scenes that I was interested in. He has sort of access to being able to stylize that, but still keep the meaning. So, was there something Latino about the movement? Probably, right? T. Carlos is an amazing Afro musical scholar, composer, incredible human. And I gave him all of the Viking sounds, and he took those and then passed it through his own individual voice.
Yeah.
And we ended up with these incredibly crunchy, beautiful melodies and harmonies that in a certain way feel ritualistic in an African way, but actually were very much based in Viking music. So I'm always interested in inviting individual humans with their
Yeah.
full humanity, everything they bring in,
Yeah.
and then see what they do. And then I find if you have an editorial eye on it, you can really sort of put it together, because Shakespeare's plays can hold that many layers. They already
Yeah.
have it, and they can
Yeah.
withstand some big swings,
Yeah.
And if I was
Yeah.
going to do Macbeth, I didn't want to just do a simple production of it. I wanted to throw some things at it because I know this play, because it's about magic and violence and war, it can withstand some of these big ideas. And those collaborators are just as obsessive as I am about sort of the way in which meaning layers. And as such, it ended up being a really satisfying process. And I'd like to think a production that really sort of, as you said, felt as visceral as it was intellectual.
Yeah. I'm curious. This is taking me on two additional paths.
Yeah.
Is you talked a lot just now about the ways in which your collaborators were filters, and
Yeah.
I wonder in what way you are the filter, because you said, "Oh, I could do an Ottoman Empire, I could do an Iranian Empire," and I just wonder, is there any part of the production where um, a young Middle Eastern student might
Mhm.
read themselves in? Is there any part of it that's an immigration story? Is it any part of it that has like Turkish little Easter eggs that
Yeah.
some students might be able to see?
I mean, it's such an interesting question because sometimes it's so hard to know what of yourself is in a production. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's
Yeah.
really literal because of content, right? Like when I did This Is Who I Am, about a mother who had died of cancer and a son who was abroad, and the like, that's so close to my personal story. There were many ways I could be like, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me. Whereas this production, because I was taking a more stylized approach, it's a little harder for me to sort of pinpoint. I do think this happens a lot with me, that I tend to put a lot of color or at least pattern and texture on stage. And if you've ever been to Istanbul, which is where I grew up, it's a noisy, patterned, loud, it's like New York on steroids, kind of place. So I feel like although it was a black on black production, there was a lot of textural elements in the
Yes, there was.
visuality of it, that feels very Middle Eastern to me. Like that feels
Yes.
like a very Middle Eastern sort of approach. And I do think that, I always say this is true for a lot of folks who have suffered terrible things. And unfortunately, a lot of Middle Eastern folks have been living through years, if not decades, if not hundreds of years of violence upon violence and colonialism, which sort of has rooted that violence in the area. So I think that sort of colonial idea of the British and the Scottish, right? That like the British are somehow higher up than the Scottish
Yeah.
and the native folks who are in that place. But the native folks are the ones that are, sort of contextualized as inherently violent, right? By this Western Christian ideology, which is actually the violent one. Um, that speaks to my personal experience of being from the Middle East in a very specific way. So again, it's a little theoretical, but that's certainly in there. And the last thing I'll say is I am always drawn to sort of tonally complicated pieces where you laugh, you cry, and then you laugh again, right? And I do
Yeah.
think David Kelly's beautiful rendition of The Porter,
Mm.
that was sort of we were trying to really write that like devil scary horror intercut with real silly clown humor. That tonal element is very Middle Eastern, because I really believe that like folks who've been through war are laughing all the time, because it's the
Yeah.
only way to survive through horrible things is to find gallows humor, if or just silly humor, silliness in those spaces. And having known and loved David Kelly's clown for so many years, I mean, it was like that was one of those things where it was just like it's got to be David Kelly, because I need that specific kind of approach to the comedy, who can also, with the naughty sparkle he has in his eyes on any day, can turn it, right? Turn it into that devil porter aspect of it. So those are some of the places that I see my sort of creativity that I think is rooted in my background. Now, if again, because it was through so many layers of stylization, I can't tell you if a young Evren would come. I think a young Evren
And
would have loved this production. Let me tell you, like that this was, I did build it for the 15-year-olds. That was actually, I kind of wanted to corrupt some young minds. I wanted those students, because it's the big student show, to be in that house and leave and like be like, I want to do that. Like I wanted to get some young folks wanting to act, after seeing
Yeah.
the show, you know? So it was, you know, some of the Game of Thrones and some of that mythological, accessible stylization was for them. And it seems like
Yeah.
it has worked. I hear
Yeah.
the students kind of loved it. So,
It was they loved it. It was so wildly popular. The young people loved it. I'm grateful to be reminded too, just in what you said about um, the colonialism framework,
mhm.
because it's important to always remember that Shakespeare was writing in service of the crown, right? He didn't have the freedom to just write anything he wanted. They were very heavily censored plays, and for it to still exist, for us to have knowledge of it, meant it had to pass the censor. And he was writing to please the crown, and that's the English crown that needed to sort of justify who
Yeah.
was sitting in that throne.
And you
And
know, there's a lot of scholarship around if Banquo and Fleance actually even existed, but that was the line that connected to the current king that he was writing
yes,
for, right?
hmm
So, and a lot of people believe that those characters were created in the history to be able to justify
yes,
that, you know, the king's
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
claim to the British
yeah.
throne. So, or Scottish first and then British. And it's, I mean, but that's what's so funny about, you know, we talk about the histories as histories, but they're really propaganda plays,
They are
right?
propaganda
They are
plays.
written for and from the perspective of the winners. Now, Shakespeare was a naughty, naughty man and a troublemaker. So when once you dive into them, there is a lot.
Yeah, I think I like to think of Shakespeare as very, very, very subversive.
Yes, me
Um,
too.
that's
But
what
it's
makes
within a
me feel
context.
good. Yeah.
Right? It's within a context, and you have to
Yeah.
sort of question some of the happy endings of those histories and the big, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Or
Macbeth also like feels
how is
good with
Merchant of
that.
Venice a comedy? Like that's not funny, you know? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So in those ways, I actually have done that was one of the big ahas of this was how much of the really act five is really a history, like it's structured like a history play with a couple of these tragic scenes, and you have to sort of, I learned that I had to treat it as such, you know, a lot of men with swords running around and saying a few lines and then a war scene and then run and then, you know, like that sort
Yeah.
of structure we're used to in the histories, and there's a way to approach it. I had to bring that to Macbeth, and that was a surprise. But, you know, that final speech by Malcolm in my production was not a happy ending
Yeah.
because I'm not convinced Malcolm was a very good guy,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So I was
mm.
interested in a world in which where it's just a cycle. So this is a new guy and the witches were there and the power corrupts, right? And the fact that he's aligned with the British doesn't make him better or more honorable or more
Yeah.
just, right?
Yeah.
And that was actually the Malcolm question was the if I did anything to the play where I really like wrestled it and pivoted it away from original intent, because all the other stylization I feel like was very much within the intent of the original play. The Malcolm and Ross changes I made and the editing and the sort of combining of things was my real attempt at stepping away from that colonial
Yeah.
idea of like the Brits are here, we're good now, right?
Yeah.
Because in my experience, when the Brits show up, it's not good now. So I was not going to go that way. So that was actually something that I would say, like, if I did anything to the play, that was what I did in a weird way.
Yeah. Well, I, I, it doesn't actually strike me as weird. I actually really love it. I think it serves as a great reminder. Like you said, the plays can bear the weight of almost anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the plays really, really can take a lot. They're very elastic in that way, and also that a lot of treatments or concepts or whatever that people think directors are doing, we're not actually necessarily doing all of that. Like some of that, the text really support. And you didn't have to heavy hand. You didn't have to
Mm-hmm.
say, I want to make a statement about the evils of colonialism. You didn't have to do that. Like it's already there,
Shakespeare
soft
put it in
textures.
there.
Yeah, like it's
It's just
already
about
there.
pulling different threads. And I mean, this is the thing I always would say, because, as with any Shakespeare festival, there is a portion of the audience that sort of, whatever original intent, original
Mhm.
text, or,
They want Elizabethan
whatever that
feeling
means,
Shakespeare.
but they don't actually want Elizabethan. They want whatever they saw as they were growing up in the 60s and 70s as Elizabethan. Like, if we're going to talk about real original,
Yeah.
American Shakespeare Company does it, I guess, as close as it's going to get.
But not even there. Not even
Exactly.
there.
Exactly. Right. So it's like, theater is a live thing. It's what's happening in front of you. And as such, to pretend like it's something else is funny to me. And the thing I always say is like, what I can't ruin? Macbeth. Macbeth will be fine. Shakespeare will be fine. Even if I do something to it and it's terrible. Even if I had directed this play and it ended up being the worst production of Macbeth ever, you know what's going to be okay? Macbeth.
Absolutely. Shakespeare will be fine.
Yeah, so like, let's not worry about him too much.
Like,
He's
you can
doing
find
okay.
Another theater down the street.
Yeah,
literally, actually, there was the theater in Grants Pass
exactly.
that was also doing Macbeth at the same time.
But in those ways, for me, I mean, I will say this: there has been in the past, like, there are certain directors that do like to bring, like, I'm setting Macbeth in space or something, sort of like very sort of put on top of kind of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, like, which is why I really love your productions of Shakespeare when you set Twelfth Night where you did. It feels of the play. It's actually from your very specific artistic individual perspective. It's when you read the play what's speaking to you. Because I always say this, if you're going to keep doing Shakespeare, it has to be because some modern artist, a director and an actor, is incredibly passionate and feels like this play has something to say for them, right?
Yes.
That's the reason to do Shakespeare in itself. Because otherwise, let's just read the plays and study them. Like, if it was an
or like not even
exercise, if it was a scholarly exercise, it's not. Theater is not a scholarly exercise. Scholarship is really important, even for new plays, right? Dramaturgy for me and the text is always at the root of something, but it's not like a production is not the text.
Yeah. And even scholarship is about an active feedback loop, an active communication. Like, we are in conversation with this thing. And I think we can be in conversation with Shakespeare and not feel obligated to always do it Elizabethan or Jacobean, like you said, whatever that means. Right. I'm a little leery even of the word concept, because then you did this gesture and I like that, because concept feels like putting something on the play
and pulling something out.
Yes. And so, yes, I know that an audience can come and see the work that I do and be like, but Dawn, you had a concept. Sure. But in my mind, it's about, it grew from underneath, right? It grew through the surface, or we excavated, we revealed something
language
that's in the text. And I definitely think that's what your Macbeth was doing, right? Like, it was revealing something. And I love how you talked about all of your collaborators as a filter, because that's filter is my word, but you talked about how they might have brought pieces of their identity to the work, because ultimately in 2024, last year, and 2025 and beyond, the way to engage with those 15-year-olds, the young Everens, the young Dawns, is to make it part of their world, and their world is right. Latin American, Turkish-American, Black, white, Asian, South Asian, trans, gay, straight, otherwise. Like, their world is so wildly diverse that to not have these teams that are filled with people that just are from all sorts of different walks of life, race, gender, ethnic, all the things, ability, disability, all the different things, is missed opportunity, because these these kids, these Gen Z and Gen A, oh, they are demanding. Okay, they
Well,
they
it's
are.
also, it's not even like, because I couldn't agree with you more, but also I will say this, the team that ended up on that show, of course at OSF, because it's been such a leader for, inclusion and diversity and equity, sort of initiatives. And me as a person, I have been such a sort of deeply committed to sort of diversifying the kind of people that get to do this work. Um, but that wasn't even actually part of the conversation, right?
Mm,
Because this is my problem, is when people show up with all white teams, I'm like, you don't know the best artists then. Because like when I make a list of the best artists I want to work with, there are some white folks in there. We had white folks on
absolutely.
the, of course there are, but they're not all
All
white,
white.
all male or able-bodied. It's
Yeah.
like Michael Magg is an incredible lighting designer. He's a painter and works with dance, which means he carves out bodies in a way that very few lighting designers do in the American theater. So if he's at OSF and I can get access to him and he can carve the crap out of those bodies and like make, as you said, real poetry with the lighting in terms of meaning and storytelling, yeah, I'm gonna work with
Yeah.
Michael Magg. You know what I mean? Of course I'm gonna work with Kevin. He's an exceptional Shakespearean actor,
Oh
right?
my
The way that
gosh.
man can so authentically and clearly and playfully activate that language. Yeah, I want him to play Macbeth. Yes, he's a black man. Cool. Let's, like, and also
Yeah.
it might be that you would want to do, let's say, a production of Macbeth where blackness is actually very centered in the way that you read the play. The play can sustain that. I'm sure it's in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But it wasn't.
it's been done, right? Like,
Exactly.
right?
Right. So I'm always excited. Like, this is the thing for me, that kind of conversation isn't actually about charity, or it's not even about, it's just about good. If you have a more diverse team, your Shakespeare production will be better.
Yes.
Like, that is a fact.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so
More
like that's
more
all.
people interrogating it from different vantage points to like really make the thing strong,
It was
to
really
really make
interesting
the
for
thing
me
strong.
because Macbeth is an incredibly gendered world, right? The female male binary is really built very solidly into it, sometimes in very interesting ways, sometimes in very problematic ways, right? And I was actually quite interested in that binary, which was surprising to people because I'm a queer creator and usually tend to be quite gender queer in the ways in which I think about it. And when I put the cast together, I sort of was lucky enough to get all my first choices. I looked at it and I was like, oh, wow, this is a very binary cast. This is very not me. But that's just what happened for this show. So there was a
Yes.
way I missed out actually in that diversity question, because in this production, I was sort of exploring this element. There is a production of Macbeth, one of the 7 that I'll hopefully get to direct, where actually there is a real interrogation of gender that I would love to do with that play, but that's a different production. And
A
that
different
that
production.
team
Yeah.
will look totally different, probably,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because to explore that question, I would want other types of
Different
people
artists in the
around
room.
me to, as you said, challenge my biases, question my givens. I'm queer, but I'm a cisgendered man. I have blind spots. As informed and educated as I am around gender queerness, it's not my lived experience. So I'm going to
Yeah.
get myself a whole lot of people around me to bring that lived experience and that
Yeah.
expertise and intellectual sort of wisdom into the room. And I think that's the thing I love about Shakespeare in production, is that that's in a way where I would like to do Shakespeare, or the Shakespeare productions I love, where that's required. Because I find that's not always as required when you're talking about like mid-century American classics. Like, you know what I mean? We're not maybe far enough from it uh, to be able to sort of bring that kind of exploration or interrogation into those productions always. People do, but it's always seen as a weird thing to do. Whereas with Shakespeare,
Yes.
it's sort of a given, which gives a director sort of generative power. And that's something I'm always excited about. Like getting to see a director be generative in the way they
Yes.
engage with work is really exciting and makes for great productions.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Evren, what are the other Shakespeare titles that you're really excited about? What's your Shakespeare list?
I mean, God, Lear. There is a Queen Lear, and that's I talked about it earlier about my mom sort of going through a very long period of illness, and she was a very independent, stubborn, amazing woman, and watching her personhood get diminished through her illnesses. And it was my sister, my brother, my sister-in-law, and I, as the youngest queer boy, sort of working with her and taking care of her. I feel like there's a story in there that I have access to that I'm really interested in digging into. I love Midsummer. There's a big sort of puppet magic, like oversized production of Midsummer that I'm dying to do. I love The Tempest. I love Coriolanus. Coriolanus was on my short list for OSF when we were trying to figure out which show to do. I think Coriolanus is so incredibly timely right now because it's so much about mob think, and how people can be tricked into acting against their own interests
Yes.
by leaders, if that sounds familiar to our American reality right now. Those are the ones that are coming up. One day I'll do a history play. I always say I love watching history plays, but I've never felt myself drawn to them to direct. But after seeing, I'll say Rosa Josie, I've mentioned her a few times. She's a brilliant history director. After seeing her productions and her edits of those plays, I'm like, oh, maybe I do want to do one of those. And that would be probably Henry IV, part 1 and 2 are, because it has that sort of intergenerational aspect.
Yeah.
The young people sort of rejecting the norm, which again feels so incredibly timely to what we're going through right now. Yeah, those are sort of some of the ones that really are ready to go.
Yes.
You know,
Now, do
we all have a
you?
list of plays where we're like, I
We
know what
all
to do.
have.
Oh, and again, of course, 12th Night. Although 12th Night is a little hard because I will say you sort of did what I would want to do with it, which is it was so gorgeous, Dawn. I think I've loved on you about that production enough, but I let me do it in public. I love that production. You should direct that play over and over again. But that's also one of the hard ones where I'm like, well, I would just kind of be doing my version of Dawn's production. So should I be doing that? You know, I need to sort of step away from it to find my slightly more unique take on it.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
and Titus.
Yes.
Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot. I love Titus.
So half the canon. Basically, you're ready to go.
I am. Like, I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's the thing with Shakespeare, again, for me, is the plays are so varied in so many ways that I can kind of get excited about many, many of them because it doesn't feel repetitive, you know? And again, of the really good ones, like a Macbeth, there's so much in it. When you're directing it, you're leaving a lot of ideas on the table, right? Like,
Absolutely.
I'm doing this version. And so, like, any of those plays I mentioned, I probably have 3-4 productions of that I could imagine myself directing.
Yeah.
So I'm like really actually looking forward to engaging with Macbeth again, as I said, because I just, once you're in it, you love it more, at least for me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And you learn more. I mean, I've done
you start ahead.
Merry Wives 3 times.
That has been your signature production, hasn't it?
I never thought I would do any Merry Wives, and now I've done it 3 times, and I feel like I keep learning more and more and more. It keeps inviting me in more and more and more.
Yeah, it's really funny. I feel like it's so funny that I haven't mentioned like Merry Wives, Comedy of Errors, like Love's Labor, like those.
No, you have a taste profile.
Yeah, I guess I do, but like I love comedy. But like to be perfectly honest, I think if I were going to do a classical comedy, I would go more like Roman comedies because my humor tends to be much more like 13-year-old boy. So I need some like dick fart jokes in there, I think. Shakespeare, as dirty as he can get, don't get me wrong, it still feels a little highfalutin in the comedies for me. Like I kind of want
Yeah,
dirtier.
I
Which
hear that.
the Roman comedies sort of hit that
They are
spot for me.
dirty.
Oh
They
God,
are
I love
very
them so
dirty.
much. Talking about like getting the youth, I did a production of The Braggart Soldier, and my favorite thing was Keiko Carrera was my costume designer, and at the time her son was I think 13, and he comes to all his mom's shows and like has to sit through there. So he came to opening, and then he brought all of his friends every weekend.
That's a win.
And I was like, I got this. Like, it might be one of my proudest achievements in the American theater is that this 13-year-old boy not only loved it, but brought all his 13-year-old boy friends to come see it because it was actually funny to him.
That's
But
such a win.
yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Um, Evren, do you find that it's more challenging for you to get offers to do Shakespeare because of how like openly proud you are to do new plays and Middle Eastern plays?
Shakespeare, getting into the Shakespeare cycle is a really interesting question for me, right? And a lot of times what I found is for young directors, they tend to go like get an internship, get an assistant directorship, do drama, like, you know what I mean? That's sort of, for a lot of folks who are coming from my background, that's sort of the way you come in because people don't think of you first, especially if
Yes.
English is your second language, right? And because I had to make money and have healthcare, and when I was coming up, I had no financial safety net as an immigrant. I was not able to take those very low paying or free, which are now more paid everywhere, I think, assistant directorships. So I never sort of made it into that list. So I sort of had to, I'm just in my 40s getting on that list for people. And I do hope that this Macbeth production, which was quite successful, has sort of reminded people that
Now
I,
you're on the list.
yeah. And some conversations are happening. I would
Great.
love to be back at OSF. I mean, it's such a wonderful place to direct, So I have hopes that I'm slowly making progress. But yeah, I am known still, like my calling card is new works. Um, but also, I mean, I think there are many directors who might think of themselves in those separate ways, but I've always been someone who wants to do everything. I want to do musicals. I want to do classics. I want to do Shakespeare. I want to do the Greeks. I want to do Tennessee Williams. I want to do Noel Coward. I want to do Mona Mansour. I want to do Paula Vogel, So I'm just drawn to voice and language. So whoever, whether it be a living writer or a writer who's been dead for 200, 300 years, whoever is engaging with those things, I find myself drawn to. So yeah, if I have anything to say to the American theater producers is stop putting directors in boxes. We can all kind
Yes.
of do anything. So that'll be my final message.
They'll hear it from you too, Evan,
I
because you're
hope.
an important guy.
Oh gosh, am I? It's so
You
funny.
you are.
Oh, thank you.
You
I
are an
appreciate it.
important voice in the United States American theater.
Oh, thank you. I so appreciate that coming from you. It really means a lot because, yeah, I've always said this, that I'm usually just trying to do plays in the way my world is. People think about me in certain ways, but that's just because I'm who I am and I'm just bringing myself to the play, right? And what I found is the beauty of theater, because it's such a collaborative and connective art, when you do that, someone who might be exactly like you or nothing like you sits in the audience and can see themselves reflected.
Mm-hmm.
And then you become important. Does that make
Mm.
sense? Like if I'm
Yeah.
important, it's just because I have had the luxury and the opportunity and the deserved opportunity through hard work to be able to put a little bit of myself and my story and my perspective on stages. And thankfully, our audiences are changing just enough that that's speaking to people who see themselves reflected in that work. That's why I'm important, if at all, you know?
Well, I think you're smart and
Oh, thanks.
generous. So I think you're a pretty big deal.
Oh,
Um, and one of four artistic directors I worked with at OSF.
isn't that funny? You've been through all of it.
It's a point of pride,
You should be, yeah. Of
like you said, like OSF has been an important part of my
course.
development, and so Bill Rausch was a great mentor of mine. Then Nataki was a director who actually hired me having seen my work, which is
Isn't that
sort
fun?
of, which is, because they tell us as, emerging directors, get people to see your work, get people to see your work. And of course, everybody's too busy to see
Exactly.
the work. Nobody can see the work. But Nataki saw the work and hired me, right? And then you were there through the transition and shepherded Twelfth Night to opening and programmed Jane Eyre and then handed off to Tim. So yeah, in my tenure, in my
Yeah.
9, 10, 10 seasons at OSF, you've been very instrumental.
Thank
Um
you.
and you know maybe in 4 or 8 years, I'll get to do a Macbeth at OSF and you can do a Lear at OSF. We
I mean,
can,
I would love to see your Macbeth. I think because you also have such a collaborative spirit as a director, right? Like you feel like on the best of days, I like to think of myself as like, like a doula or something, like a birth, like you're like
yes,
getting the thing to come out, right? That's, I always feel like your strength and really galvanizing a group of people towards working together to come up with that thing that's so much larger than any one person's idea. And it's so authentically what you do. I don't even know if you're always aware of how much space you're giving others to be able to do that amazing work. So I think again, Macbeth is one of those that like needs a strong perspective, but needs that kind of approach because the play is too big
yeah, I
for
hear
one
that. I
person to
hear that.
figure it out. So
Yeah.
I think you would, yeah, I would
Well,
pay
you,
money to see your Macbeth anywhere.
well, you talked about how so many people talk about it as a play of youthful ambition.
Yeah.
And for me, it's actually a play about people who are so worried that they've lost an opportunity for a legacy. For
Yes.
me, so much of what's happening for the Macbeths as a couple is the loss of a child
Yes.
and perhaps the inability,
Mm-hmm.
um, certainly on Lady M's part, to have more.
Mm-hmm.
So
If
so
I can't
that
birth a child, then let me birth this.
yes,
I think
like
Erica actually talked a lot about that
yeah,
as we were
what
working,
it
and her
yeah,
performance of that role
yeah,
was, I mean, it was
yeah.
just,
I mean, of course, Erica, because she's she's a mom like me.
yeah,
She can understand those lines. Like I have given
mhm,
suck and know how tender 'tis.
yeah,
And like the weight of that kind of language, and knowing that them as a couple, they don't have an heir.
mhm,
So when you what is, first of all, like what is a legacy, right? Like what are we ambitious for? This idea that there,
yes,
what are we ambitious for? What is the legacy? And it's this idea that like our children make us immortal. Okay, well, what about people who don't want children, who can't have children? Like, what is it then, right? Well, I mean, if you're a king,
that's legacy.
I mean, your name is written in the book,
Mhm.
and then you get to name an heir from that, so then, but uh, that's a whole nother.
I love it. I love it. Go pitch
so
that play to somewhere, and
so
then let me
hi,
know when it's happening because I'll be there.
hire Everett for the big puppet much ado, no, it was
Midsummer.
Midsummer, the big larger than life Midsummer, for
Yeah,
his Queen Lear,
yeah.
his Coriolanus. Coriolanus is the one that I'm like, yeah, I'm not ready. I think it is so
It
super
needs a
timely.
crowd. That one is a challenge because I mean the plot, if the play on Shakespeare translation of Coriolanus proved anything to me, that plot is thorny. Like to make sense of if Rosa had to wrestle it so hard and she's so good at wrestling histories and like plot heavy plays, I'm like, oh wow, this is harder than I thought actually.
Yeah.
But for Coriolanus, like I would want 30, 40 people. Like I want a
Oh
mob
wow.
on stage, you know?
Wow.
Because
Yeah.
that's what it's for me, that's the meaning of the play. How like two
Yeah.
people can move 40 people against their own interests by just activating their base instincts, you know?
Yeah.
And it just feels really important. And you know, they did it with 7 people, so it's possible, but I think my production would need like
Yeah.
I need to
Yeah.
go to Europe to do that one. You know,
It was,
American theaters
I,
can't do it without 40 people.
saw Rosa's production, and I hope to be able to get Rosa on the show. And Jessica D. Williams as well, just
Oh my God.
blew my mind. But I always joke with people that, like, on 2 hours notice, I could probably pitch you any Shakespeare play
That's true.
except Coriolanus.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like you want,
That's not the one.
you wanna talk All's Well, you wanna talk Two Gents, you wanna talk Taming of the Shrew, you wanna talk Merchant of it, you wanna talk all the, like, give me 2 hours and I can
I'll come up
come
with an
up with
idea.
something that we can have a conversation around. Coriolanus, I'm like, let's check back in after my 50th birthday.
Fair.
I just don't know. I
Have you
don't
done
know.
Winter's Tale?
I have done A Winter's
Okay, I
Tale.
was gonna say that would be a great match for you as well, I'd like to think.
Yeah, that was gosh, 15 years ago that I
So
did
it's
Winter's
time.
Tale.
It's time for you
It's
to do it as a grown
it's
woman, you know?
it's definitely time. It's definitely,
Just talk about a
I
play
mean,
that has so much in it. Like talk about
yeah, yeah. And these are plays, like you said, that we can come back to again and again and again and again and again and again. And where we are in our life also changes our relationship to the play, you know.
100%. Yeah, I
Um,
think I mean, and it's so funny. American theater is so obsessed with youth sometimes and emerging, right? And I'm always so excited for grown folks to come back to plays, do new works. And, I feel like there is generative new energy at any age or at any point
Absolutely.
in someone's career. And I'm always
Absolutely.
excited to engage with those exciting productions that might be coming from a 50-year-old on, not yet, but soon, um, because I think there is, yeah, we all have something to say at every age. You know what I mean? If you keep yourself engaged with the current moment, which, I know you do. So,
Um, Evren, it has been such a deep, deep pleasure to get this time with you. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with
oh my
me.
gosh, it was an honor. And when you asked me, I was like, yes, the answer is yes, let's schedule it because it's just, I feel like I love talking to other directors about the art, not career, not, like about what we get up every morning to do.
Yes.
So it's such a joy to do it, over lunch, but it's also really fun to do it in this context. And congratulations on this podcast. I feel like it was a long time coming. So I'm just so excited that you have finally taken the plunge and are doing this.
Yes. What a selfish excuse to talk to all the coolest kids
Hey,
about Shakespeare.
you're like, I'm not doing it for anyone else. This is for me.
I I mean, I hope people watch. I hope they enjoy it. I hope they like, comment, subscribe.
That's right. You're supposed to
I'm
say
supposed
that
to sneak
for
those
sure.
things in. But any excuse to talk about, like you said, the art, why we do what we do, what gets our heart beating faster, what we find exciting in the work, what we find problematic in the
Yeah, of
work,
course.
and
There's plenty of that
all of
too.
that.
We didn't really dive into it, but I think like anything worth engaging with, Shakespeare has many, many thorns because he was a man of a very specific time. And as you said, he was writing under very specific conditions, right? So if you're going to engage with that work, you have to be sort of open-eyed about it and figure it out. But that act of figuring out is the work for me, I get really excited by that.
3, 2, 1. Let's go.